Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. This is the Roaming Prepper channel. I am your host, Pete, and thank you for joining me today. So, today we're going to talk about low tech chaos. Uh, what the heck is low tech chaos? I'll be right back and I'll explain exactly what I'm talking about and how, as preppers, we need to think about this kind of situation because I think we get in a box, we get in this echo chamber where we hear certain things and we overlook the more basic ones. It goes back to my 80-20 rule. I'll be right back. Let's talk about what I'm thinking about. Welcome back, everyone. So, today I want to talk about the arson that occurred at the Olympics. So, for those of you unfamiliar, as you may know, the Olympics is going on in France right now, and despite all the debacle about the opening ceremonies and the satanic undertones and anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anyway, that caused a big scene. Honestly, the more I see this demonic satanic stuff, the more I think it's not I mean it's there, it's ugly, but I think it's a distraction from boots on the ground things like physical things going on. So one of the big fears the French had, at least from the news I've read, and I went through Yahoo News, Fox, CNN, kind of get a general feel. The French were worried about cyber attacks. They were worried about more blatant things, bombings, a mass shooting, something like that, suicide bombers, suicide truck, whatever. Uh, so they were prepared for that. But around the Olympics, now what they were not prepared for was somebody to go to the control stations at the trains 2 hours away and set them on fire. And so there are reports that three of the big speed rail lines were down for hours and caused massive delays and a bunch of logistical issues because someone went to these substations that are largely unprotected. If you don't know what one is, go to a railroad crossing and just look. There's a little house by all the crossings, almost all of them, which is where they control the usually just the crossing bars, the crossing gates, and the alarms. But if you go to bigger rail yards, there's actually bigger houses that have controls for all the switches, etc. And so instead of using a bomb, instead of using some other device, even a drone, because they had drones in the air like Reaper and Hawkeye drones looking at everything. They didn't do that. Whoever did this basically sent a dude with gasoline and set it on fire and then ran away and burned the can. So no fingerprints, can's gone, house is gone, control thing's gone, train shut down. Like multi-billion dollar rail system shut down for hours by a dude with gas and matches. This sounds like something out of a bad country song. Of course, France immediately blamed Russia, but not everyone agrees that it was them. It could be. We've had the fire at General Dynamics. I'm sure you guys heard about that. If you didn't, go look that one up. I won't talk about it here. The fire at BAE, British Armory, over in England. The fire at the German metal plant, which also conveniently manufactures ammunition for the exact weapons Ukraine needs. So there's been a lot of fires. We've had fires here. They've chicken plants on fires, cattle's on fire, everything's on fire. They burned down chunk of New Mexico a month and a half ago. Um, by the way, they arrested somebody for setting fire out here in Texas. A firefighter. Whole nother story for another day. However, so fire is a very convenient and commonly used tool. Granted, we don't know if all of these instances are sabotage, but I know the Brits definitely said whatever happened to BAE was sabotage. They determined that much. They arrested a Russian national, and the French claim to have arrested a Russian citizen who may be linked to these fires. But I'm going to play a little clip from you from GB News. This is kind of a fringy news. I like to listen to them because they're a little bit off the wall at times. Um, they're not as fun as Sky News in Australia because those guys, I will sit there in tears listening to them. But the Aussies have a sense of humor. I'll play this for you, but not everyone's on board with this accusation that Russia's behind everything, and they're thinking maybe Russia is just a convenient scapegoat. But let's listen. I'll let you guys listen.
Happened yesterday morning. What appears to be a coordinated attack on some of the French infrastructure. Security specialist Will Geddes is here. Morning, Will.
Morning.
The fingers of blame are being pointed, but in numerous directions.
Yes, of course.
Vague far left accusations, whatever that means.
Yeah, well, the sort of vague far left accusations are probably a little bit more mute than, say, blaming or putting the blame at the door of Russia, which I think is probably more likely to be the candidate behind it. I mean, you have to really break it down. In terms of the actual attacks themselves on these various different transportation hubs, they were pretty low level. They're low key. They were fires. They were arson. Now, one might say, yes, that's pretty easy to organize and very easy to implement. However, to plan it is an entirely different thing. It's a question of where those fires would be placed, where would they be undertaken, and that takes a considerable amount of planning to think, okay, if we want to disrupt the infrastructure to a country, how are we going to do it? And I've been involved in these kinds of operations before in the planning of them. And you look at what can you do to disrupt and embarrass a nation? And that's really would be the objective. And the key thing is to look at these things and go, what is the motivation behind it? Why would someone do this?
Well, what is
you
the
answer
motivation?
it. Yes.
So, well, it would be to embarrass the nation. It would be to show that obviously,
why?
well, to be honest, Russia is in a very precarious position right now with this whole encroachment of NATO, the whole Ukraine situation, the presidential elections right now. There are lots of things that certainly would assist Russia in unstabling or destabling certain countries in terms of their capability, their resilience, their robustness in terms of their security. Now, everybody knows the eyes of the world are focused on France right now. This opening ceremony yesterday, which I think was incredibly brave to do on the Seine, the planning that goes behind that, I certainly wouldn't have wanted that
Almost
job.
impossible to police, I would have thought.
Oh, virtually impossible, absolutely, and even then, with all the resources that you can throw at it, you've still got that margin of potential vulnerability. And they had an option to put it in the Place de Concorde as the alternate. Now, if they had stepped down from the Seine to Place de Concorde, they would have lost some face in the eyes of the world in terms of the security threats, because there were a few individuals that were arrested in advance of the games who had jihadist plots, obviously against the games. So to keep it in the same, they had to show resilience. So what is another way to potentially get at them? And that is to disrupt their infrastructure.
They did make arrests yesterday as well following these fires, didn't they?
Yeah.
So those people will be able to tell us something
Maybe
about the derivation of their plot.
I was interested. You said maybe. Are you talking things like cutouts?
Well, there's all sorts of things that you can potentially do. I mean, there was one individual that was actually arrested prior or just in the immediate wake of these attacks who was connected to FSB, which is the domestic intelligence agencies for Russia. Now, he seems to have disappeared a little bit. Now, you've got to bear in mind as a nation, they're going to want to be very careful about what they actually put out in the public
Disappeared a
domain.
little bit. I like that.
So I would say we're probably never going to get the true answer necessarily to who was behind this. And it is convenient, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any stretch, but it's convenient to place the door of responsibility as, say, a far left group.
Right.
So as you can see, this guy's not sold. The government saying it could be far left, it could be jihadi, it could be Russian. We will all never really get the true story. But low tech chaos, I'm really not doing this video to talk about what happened in France. I want to talk about how that could affect us here. We have a large number of people have come into the country improperly vetted. People will argue with me on the internet till the cows come home that no, with the immigrants, you're a racist. And all right, whatever. The bottom line is the fact that we have known felons, known rapists coming into the country and killing young women, including Yoselin and little Edie down in San Antonio, Jocelyn Nungare down in Houston. There are a lot of people who are nefarious, that are evil, that are violent or criminal, who have come into the country, it stands to reason there are likely operative types in the country who are capable of something like this. So we can't, we wouldn't see that, right? The US is so cybersecurity, EMP, hacking, you know, massive terror bombing, but stuff like this bothers me a lot more because this is the kind of stuff that's really hard to get a handle on. It's very inexpensive to execute. Any jackass who understands the use of a lighter and gasoline can execute an arson fire. And again, think of this for a second. Imagine, for example, setting cars on fire on multiple bridges at one time. Right now, we all have our conspiracies and thoughts about the bridge in Baltimore, the ship turn, whack the bridge. But it stands to reason you could just set vehicles on fire on a bunch of bridges and absolutely disrupt an area. You could go and set tankers on fire and cause a massive mess. There's so many little things. My big fear is the low tech stuff is going to fly under the radar because we're worried about the cyber attacks, the EMPs, or the really elaborate Mumbai or Charlie Hebdo style attacks, and not the jackass with a can of gasoline and a lighter who basically shut down $1 billion train system. Now, who did it? Russia? Possibly. Russia would embarrass. Could it be jihadi? Certainly. The jihadis in France have a long history of not liking each other. It could be a variety of people. What I want you all to understand, and this is just from my perspective, right? So take it how you will, is we need to understand how these lower tech things can affect us. For instance, where I live now, I'm in a city, but out in the country. So if they shut down the railways with a bunch of fires, for instance, what will happen here? Well, I'm in proximity to oil and gas refineries that make fuel, at least one National Guard and one Air Force base, and a very high quantity of veterans and hunters in the area, plus a pretty decent little police force. So our problem would be water and food, right? Making sure that the water is kept up, the food is kept up. But imagine if you're in a place like New York City, right? I can drive, hell, I can take an electric golf cart that I charged with solar and drive 20 minutes to a farm and trade for whatever I need, or the farmers come into town with the National Guard protecting them and set up places to purchase, right? There's options where I am. Our biggest threat would be the loss of water and power in the extreme heat. But imagine a place like Chicago or Manhattan or Pittsburgh where you have millions of people surrounded by water and there's no resource there, right? There's buildings and those subways go down all at once, or they shut down all the tunnels all at once. Think of what happened in 9/11. That's a nightmare. Imagine the cops that are in Manhattan, because New York has about a 50,000 person police force. Let's say you got 10,000 cops in Manhattan any given day. I'm just spitballing a number here. And, however many firefighters, and the city gets shut down and kind of locked off. How are you going to feed all those people? That's an insane thing to think about. And they can't escape because they're surrounded by rivers that will literally drown them. Understand your area and understand how stuff like this can affect you. And then you can kind of prep for it. So, for example, if you work in Manhattan, I lived in New York for years in my childhood and when I did my internships. So, yeah, if you're in Manhattan and you're like, hey, if something pops off, now what? Well, you could keep in your desk, you can lock your desk, you can have a stash of MREs, you could put snacks, you could put bottles of water, a water filter, you could have a bug out bag, a get home bag, whatever it is you think you need. You could have a subway bag, and just make it specifically a small little bag. You get on the subway, what if the subway goes down and you're on the train? And I talked about this a year and a half ago. You're on a train and the train shuts down. Well, now you're going to be on foot and not necessarily in a safe place, uh, that you could fall off an elevated platform or you can get electrocuted, whatever the case is. understanding how these weird low tech attacks could affect you. You're in Pittsburgh and they start burning cars on bridges. You can't get from Pittsburgh to, like, say, Carmichael's, which is on, because it's split by a river. How do you get across that? How do you get? Do you know paths around? Do you know alternate paths? Do you know how to do a water crossing without drowning or killing someone else in the process? Understanding how these lower tech attacks can affect you will absolutely help you plan what you need to have in your get home bag, your office bag, your subway tote, whatever you want to call it. And it kind of gives you some clarity. Again, my part of Texas is kind of an anomaly because, other than a lack of a river, we're kind of away from everything, and we could scatter in 360 degrees, right? But you're in, like, Houston. Well, Houston, you can do the same, but you're in Manhattan Island, or you're in Chicago, or you're in a certain city where you're surrounded by rivers. You're going to get cut off. Now what? Do you know another way home? Do you have amenities to get through 24, 48 hours in your office? So just something to think about. I do think this French thing is interesting. I think I could think of a dozen people who'd have wanted to do that. So the Russians are an easy blame. But who knows? Maybe someone just didn't like that opening show where they kind of made a mockery of the Last Supper. But, that's just me speaking. Anyway, folks, I'll leave you with that. Think about how weird low tech stuff could affect the way you get home, and how you can get to your loved ones, how your kids can get home from school. I'll leave you with that thought. Plan, keep your mind focused, pay attention to what's going on. Godspeed, God bless. I will see you all on my next video. Keep out of trouble out there.